this is yards and yard limits presentation. And when I first thought about this, I had 2 slides. And
It's going to be a quick clinic.
yeah, it was going to be a quick clinic. I think I'm up to about 40.
Okay.
So it'll be a little longer. But the more I looked into this yards and yard limits problem or idea, the more I had to look at the code books and the rules and timetables and union agreements. So the more I dug into this, the more I found out about yards and yard limits. And to me, it was extremely interesting, especially how you can apply it to your model railroad. And it doesn't make any difference whether you're doing a huge model railroad that has to do with 10, 20, 30 guys coming over in operations, or whether you've got a shelf layout with a little bit of main line and a small yard. If you look at the code books and the timetables and things like that, you can apply all this stuff to your model railroad, or how it might apply to your model railroad. And so we'll just take a look at this as we go through. And if you got any questions, please bring them up as we traverse through these. If you've got a portion of your railroad that might apply to a particular slide, let us know about that. And we just don't want to drag it into the evening hours. So, so anyway.
Well, with 40 slides, that'll probably take about 3 hours, won't it?
No, we'll go through that. Okay, so the basic evolution of the rules. And I looked at yard limits and yards, and they kept going back to, well, what is the rule for a yard limit and a yard? So that's where I had to go back to. So I went all the way back to the 1850s, and Ron's email this week just helped me support this presentation. I think it was an 1858 rule that he found about 2 trains meeting each other. Can you guys see me too?
Yes.
Oh,
Yep.
okay. Good. All right, good, because I've got some samples here I may show from time to time. The 1850s and on, for quite some time, the only rules that were published in individual timetables for a particular railroad. So Ron's rule number 8 might not have applied to any other railroad but that rule that it came out of, or the railroad it came out of, were for 2 trains for the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad, or whatever it was. So who knows? But so pamphlets were developed, timetables were developed, and the rules were in those timetables. No other books, no government rules, nothing like that. And today, and you'll still find a lot of rules in the timetables. So, and we'll talk about that in specifics later on. In 1887, the railroads finally started to get together, because obviously there were more railroads and more trains and so forth. So, and they were traversing across the country, or getting that way. So they started to come up with this thing called the Standard Code of Operating Rules. And that was basically the first book, or whatever you want to call it, standard that was developed. And you'll notice that it wasn't even formalized until 1949. So it took a long time to get a standardized set of rules for all the railroads in the United States. And we'll talk a little bit more about the SCOR in another portion of the slide presentation. So we finally get to the modern era, or whatever we want to call it, and we come up with the Code of Federal Regulations. All right, the government is getting more involved with our railroads. And of course, they've got more involved with everything in the United States, right, Jim? So the Code of Federal Regulations was first produced in 1938. So even that took quite some time. So underneath that, or within that Code of Federal Regulations, we have a thing called the Consolidated Code of Operation Rules. That lasted for a while. We have the Northeast Operating Rules Advisory Committee. That is still in existence. We have the General Code of Operating Rules, that is still in existence. And then we have some subgroups in the CFR, like the FRA and the AAR. And they have specific duties when it comes to railroads. In Canada and Mexico, they have rule books as well, but they have their own sets. Obviously, they're a different government, so they're going to have their own set of rules. So rule books. Rule books are an interesting piece of material because they are almost railroad specific. So if you take the General Code of Operating Rules, that's the book on the left, that blue book with, and it's hard to read the text because the text is in gold. For some reason, they like to put gold text on their books. I don't know why, but it makes it hard to take pictures. So the General Code of Operating Rules is a book that certain railroads buy into. If you look at the first few pages of that book, it won't list all of the railroads, but it will list the railroads that buy into the General Code of Operating Rules. Then you got on the far right, you got the Consolidated Code of Operating Rules, which kind of preceded the GCOR. That was very specific as well. And that Consolidated Code of Operating Rules were mostly Northwest railroads, Spokane, SPNS, Great Northern, as far east as Minneapolis area. I think the CNNW is in the Consolidated Code of Operating Rules. Other areas of the United States had different rule books, but the rules were about the same for all of them. You get in the middle book there, that's the SP, and I'm going to point out another book later on. The Southern Pacific Line's rule books and rules and regulations was specific only towards or only for the SP railroad. So they wrote their own book, and other railroads did the same thing. And I'll point one out later. I've got it in the wrong slide, but I'll point it out. When we get to some of these rules about yards and yard limits later in the presentation, you'll find that some of these books will have rules about yards and yard limits, and some of them won't. They will have a definition, but they won't have a rule number. So we'll talk about that a little bit. When you look at the one in the, if you were pick up the SP book and look at that, you'll find that it has Rule 93 in it, for instance, which is yard limits. But it might have 4 or 5 caveats to that, depending on where the railroad is at. In other words, which division it applies to and so forth. So then we have timetables. Timetables are really great for, if you don't get anything else for your railroad, if you're gonna model a particular railroad or model after a particular railroad, try to find an employee timetable for that railroad. There's a ton of information that you can get off the timetable that'll help you develop your model railroad even before you start building it. You get all these ideas. I was going to put a couple slides at the end about how that applies to model railroads, but I think it turned out better for me to talk about them as we go through each slide. So I model the Western Pacific, and I model a specific area from Wendover, Utah to Salt Lake. So the employee timetable, and by the way, these are employee timetables, not the ones for the public. You want to get the employee timetable. It'll usually say for the operation of the employee or for the government of employees only or whatever. So I got the Western Pacific one, Eastern Division. The WP was divided into 2 divisions, East and West. I'm in the Eastern Division, and I'm in the 4th subdivision. So that's the employee timetable that I use. But try to find one that's specific for your railroad. So how do we use that timetable for model railroad? Well, if we take a look at it, employee timetable, you'll see that there's all kinds of stuff listed on it besides. Can you see my mouse?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, so besides a train number and times for those trains, you'll see that it also shows milepost markers. That's in this column here. And then if you're going to signal your railroad, Dan, this is an area of the timetable you want to look at. Right here, it says traffic control system. So that's the traffic control signal system for this area of the timetable. In this case, it's from Polar Junction all back west to Wendover. All right. And down here we see yard limits and so forth. But this timetable could easily have been divided up into TCS for these portions of the location along the line, or MBS or ABS for other portions, and those will be listed in a bracket on the timetable on the left-hand side. Is everyone, or is there anyone that's not familiar with an employee timetable? Everybody is? Okay, well, I'm going to go over it anyway. So here's your towns or stations that are listed. By the way, you don't have to have a depot. You don't have to have a station building. It could be just a sign along the right of way, and that could be a station. Those are listed here. Mileposts over there, signaling here, stations, and then in this column there's a whole bunch of letters, right? And the only place you're going to find the definition of these letters is not in the timetable. You're going to have to go find a rule book that will have these letters listed, and this is what it will look like in the rule book on the right hand side over here. We get down, let's see here, a P is a phone, so this station has a phone. A bulletin board is B, interlocking is I, and so forth. You see F is for fuel. If you get into an older timetable, you're going to find that you might find a W for water, or C for coal. Obviously, that's going to be for steam trains, so you're going to have an older timetable. The nice thing about this is that here's a flag stop, for instance. So if you've got a model railroad and you're doing passenger stuff, and you don't want to have a station, a building, or whatever, you could have just a flag stop in your timetable listing for times or stops and arrivals and departures. Anyway, this information is in a code book. This type of information is in a timetable. So we mentioned that the FRA and the AAR are part of the Code of Federal Regulations, and so they put out all kinds of books, and your railroads will put out books as well. There's AAR puts out a field manual for interchange rules. This is back from 1970. Most of my stuff is going to be 70s because that's the era that I model. So the books I pick up are for like 65 to 75. The FRA put out a book on rules, standards, instructions for railroad signals. And of course, those are the kind of things that the railroad books, the code books, will glean their information from and put their signal information in. None of the railroads have a lot of different rules for signals. I'm sure you guys know that. The next book around here is the Sioux Line Railroad, Operating Rules and Instructions. This actually is this book should have been in the previous slide for rule books. You won't even find a rule in this book for yard limits, which is part of what we're talking about today. What you will find is a rule for restricted speed and a rule for flagging or protection. And that's their rules for going out of the yard into the main line. And we'll define that a little bit later. But there's all these other kind of books are available to you. I imagine Bob Blake could use this book. He has a section on his railroad where he does a lot of traffic with containers and trailers on flat cars. Well, here's a book that explains how to do that whoops, excuse me. Down here, here's a specific, very specific book on just a yard that the SP has in Los Angeles, one of their terminals. All kinds of rules just for working in the yard. This one here is for general car foremen and car inspectors. And I was wondering why this book was red, the color red. And then when I found out that it is from the Bureau of Explosives. So there's some very interesting stuff in that book. And then this tan colored book or brown book is from the SP, and that has to do with dining cars, hotels, restaurants, and there's all kinds of stuff in there about how it's built and how they set them up and that type of thing. So, but it's interesting reading. All right, so here's 3 books that I feel, besides Timetable, that are pretty handy for your model railroad. The one in the middle we'll talk about a little specific, but the one on the left is the ORER. I imagine all you folks have heard about that. It's the official equipment railroad. Boy, I'm confused here. ORER. Help me out, Rich. What does the ORE mean? ORER. What is that?
I can't remember, but that's where you're looking up all your box cars and various cars as to who owns what year and all that stuff.
Yeah,
It's
it's
registered.
official. What?
Registered.
Yeah, it's ORER, Official Railway Equipment Register is
There you
what it
go.
is. Okay, and that book is, the publisher has changed about 10 years ago, but that book is still available. We used that book where I worked. I worked in safety and security products for a company in California, and we dealt with the railroads quite often, along with transportation trucks and border patrol and things like that. So, but we used this book extensively because we had to know about different kinds of freight cars. And if you buy an old one, it's going to probably be anywhere from about a 1/2 inch or to a 1 inch thick book. The latest issue I got is someplace, and I got it over here on the table. It's someplace in about the year 2000s, and my current or latest issue of ORER is almost 3 inches thick. There's all kinds of brand new types of freight cars out there. The book on the right is the Official Guide of the Railways. That changed names about maybe 10, 12 years ago to the official, I think it's called the Official Railway Guide. This is an interesting book because it lists not only railroads, but it will also list freight railroads besides passenger railroads and ships. So it's kind of an interesting book. The one in the middle, the Official Register of Passenger Train Equipment. This book started coming out in the late 30s, and it is no longer produced after Amtrak. So I think my issue is mid 60s. So after Amtrak, it was not needed anymore. That publication went away. It was published by the same group that did the ORER book. So anyway, good to have books in your era of railroading. Here's a couple more books that are pretty good for your model railroad operations. The book on the left is called Rights of Trains. And the interesting thing about this particular book is it actually starts out with the first set of codes. If you go back to here, the Standard Code of Operating Rules, right here, the SCOR, that is how this book starts. It starts out with the Standard Code of Operating Rules. So I did look, Ron, I could not find Rule 8. I think Rule 8 was in somebody's timetable, but it's an interesting start of how rules were developed for the model for railroads. So it's a fun book to read. And it's very, very beneficial for model railroad applications. The book on the right, Condensed Code of Operating Rules. This sounds like a pretty official book. It is a book for model railroads, period. It is not a government book. And but it's laid out just like a book that might be called the General Code of Operating Rules from the government or for the operation of railroads. It has all the basic chapters and definitions and things like that, but it is a condensed book. So it's not going to have 1,000 rules in it, but it's going to have the right kind of rules to operate a model railroad. And you can still get this book. Both these books are available. And I don't know what edition they are today. I believe the one on the right is still edition 1951. The one on the left will be a later edition than what I probably have. All right, so we finally get to the point of the discussion of what's a yard, okay? Again, we're gonna go back to the Code of Federal Regulations and try to determine what does a yard mean? Or what's the definition of a yard? So the Code of Federal Regulations says Title 49. Oh, by the way, there's 50 titles in the Code of Federal Regulations. There's 50 of them today. There used to be 56 or 57. That changed a number of years ago, quite a few number of years ago. Now I think there's 50. So Title 49 is transportation. And there's all kinds of things that are in the transportation title, but you go to subtitle B, which is other regulations relating to transportation, and you get down to chapter 2 of title B, which is a Federal Railroad Administration Department of Transportation. And then you get to parts 200 to 299, and you finally get down to 299.5 yard, okay? And here's what it says. It says means a system of tracks within defined limits and outside of the territory controlled by signals, which can be used for the making up of trains or the storing of maintenance away equipment. What does that really mean? And there's no rule there, right? It just tells you what a yard is, right? But the part that is actually, there's two parts, but the part that is most important is the part that says outside of the territory controlled by signals. So you wouldn't expect to, now we know that there are signals in, usually dwarf signals or whatever, in yards, right? Or there may be, right? But yard doesn't have to have those things, right? So a yard is off the main line. So a yard has nothing to do with the main line of train traffic. It has to do with just making up trains and storing equipment and that type of thing. So we're going to talk about 3 types of yards briefly, but this is not in the part 299.5 because it just doesn't tell you what should be in your yard. It just says that it's not part of the territory controlled by signals. So we're going to look at a flat, gravity, and hump yard, and that's going to be brief. So we'll go look at that. So a flat yard switching is a flat yard has no hump, relies on locomotives and riders on the car for movements, right? So that's a flat yard. If we take a look at how dangerous that might have been, here's a picture of a boxcar that's been kicked away, and you've got a guy riding up there on a little teeny tiny platform, ready to slow the car down before he slams into the next car on a class track and throws himself off the top of the boxcar. So I don't know, the only thing he's hanging on to is that wheel, which is doing this. So that doesn't sound like a fun place to work. So that's a brakeman up there. The switchman was down on the ground uncoupling the cars. So that's a flat yard switching. Gravity yards is a little more complex. A gravity yard usually built on a natural slope or a hump and relies less on the locomotives for car movement. And generally, locomotives will consist being sorted from an uphill location and they'll, switchman will let go of the cars, and the cars will start rolling down, and they'll accelerate through their classification tracks. So instead of a brakeman riding on the cars, you got this type of thing. This is called a Dowty retarder. And a Dowty retarder was developed by a company in England, and they are still in business. They make all kinds of hydraulic control equipment. But they developed this a number of years ago, probably in the 40s, to slow cars down as they're moving down the hill or down the slope into their classification tracks. And these are all along the tracks from the time the car is let go until it slams into the car where it's heading to. And you can see in the back on the next track over, you can see some additional Dowty retarder plungers hydraulically controlled back here on this other track. And it's hard to see, but they're on the other class tracks in this picture as well. So it's not just three things, it's a whole bunch of them that the car is rolling across. Now, what happens if they get slowed down too much? There's Dowty made a device that actually pushes up. It's a rounded device. Whoops, excuse me. Can't hit the mouse button. It's a rounded device that right here, it would spring up and make the car go faster. And it would push on the wheel and start the car to go faster. That's how the Dowty retarders systems worked. Mostly used in the UK, obviously, that's where they were developed, and they were extensively used, and I think they still are. I think I've got some photos of them from China. China used them in all their yards over there. So that's the Dowty retarder. The last type of class yard we'll talk about is the hump yard switching, and that's going to be mostly US use. It's a hump yard that's on a constructed hill. The cars are shoved over the hill with a yard locomotive, and then gravity is used to propel the cars down to the various sorting tracks. And they've got these retarders along the tracks to slow the car down. And we'll show you a picture of that. So here's one looking downhill at the track, and there's probably 2 or 3 of these retarders behind the photographer. There's these little boxes right here, and these little things sticking up on both sides. Those are sensors sensing the speed of the car as it goes down. And then these two, or this thing right here, will squeeze against the wheels and slow the car down, depending on how much speed the car was moving as it went through there. And then you can see the class tracks down here in the background. So that's a hump yard control. You'll have a guy up here in the tower. You'll have a locomotive engineer up pushing the train. You'll have a switchman letting go of the cars as they uncouple and going down the hill. He has a list that he looks at, and it'll tell him, do I let 1 car go, or 2 cars go, or 3 cars go before I do the uncouple? So that's the way that works. So the speed sensors and retarded brakes. And if you've been fortunate enough to visit one of these yards, you'll know that they aren't quiet. When those retarders hit the wheels, there's a lot of squeaking going on. All right, major yard components. We know it's not just a series of tracks off the main line to make up trains. There's all kinds of things involved in a yard. There's the receiving and arrival yards, there's switching and sorting yards, there's classification, which is what we call it in Canada, in US and Canada. Marshalling yards is also in Canada as a definition, and UK. We'll have a departure yard where blocking is accomplished. Blocking is putting your cars in a certain order so that it's easier for the next station down the line. And car repair, maintenance yards, engine facilities, transfer yards, unit yards, coach yards, and it goes on and on. So that simple little definition from the Code of Federal Regulations creates this type of a organization when it finally gets out in the field to the railroads. Yard tracks, again, the yards are divided up further into scale tracks and cleaning and storage and freight house and icing and passenger car house tracks, That's usually a track right behind the station. Caboose, locomotive service. So the yards are further divided. The railroad likes to name every piece of track that they have anyway. So that's what happens here. Then you've got the people that work in the yards. These are established yard codes from the FRA. And you will see that there's the car retarder operator. All right, that's the guy that's probably up in the tower. He's helping with that situation with deciding which cars go where. The herder man. Herder man is couples the engines and takes them off upon arrival and departure of trains. He is not a hostler. Okay, he's not a switchman. Right, he works when a locomotive comes in or a train comes in. He's the guy that's going to uncouple the locomotive so it can go, so that either a hostler or a road engineer will take it over to the engine facility or bring it back. Inside hostler, it's usually a fireman, and he handles the movement of engines in and around the service area and the shops, and that's it. That inside hostler cannot leave the shops area with a locomotive. And like I said, he's usually a fireman. He's been trained enough to start the locomotive, move it out of the engine house, put it on the turntable, maybe turn it around, put it back in the engine house, whatever. And that's all he can do. Then there's the outside hostler. This guy's got a little more experience, and he can handle the movement of engines between the passenger station or service area on the main track. I talked to a conductor on Amtrak in September when I went out to Arizona, and he used to be an outside hostler for forget what railroad it's called down in Florida. Anybody remember what Florida railroad is? Anyway, he worked for the railroad down there. He was an outside hostler. He had permission to be able to move locomotives from the one engine facility to another in as many as 85 miles. His restriction was he can't pull a train. He can move locomotives as a hostler, but he can't pull a train. So he was an outside hostler. Who knows what a skatesman is? Anybody know what a skatesman is? Come on, Rich, you must know what a skatesman is.
No.
I think it is, that's when they used to put the skate underneath the car to slow it down.
Yep, thank you, Ron. A skatesman is a dangerous job. You don't want to, I wouldn't want to be the skates guy, but it actually looks like a skate in a sense. It has a little collar that fits around the head of the rail, and you can just move it back and forth. And it has a curved portion on the top of that skate that kind of matches the contour of the wheel. And if a car is coming at you, you can use your skate to help slow the car down. You don't have, you're not going to be on it to hit the handbrake or something like that. I can't imagine, I don't know if skatesman still exists, but I can't imagine being a skatesman.
Ron knew the answer because he's older than me.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, he's older than me, so I had to look that one up. I could not figure out in the world what a skatesman was. I should have put a picture of it, but I didn't. Then you've got other guys on there: yard foremen, brakemen, conductors, engineers, firemen, yard pilots. If you're a new guy working a yard, you're going to be assigned a yard pilot for a while, and he's going to show you how to move around from one part of the yard to the other, just like you have pilots on that move ships in and out of harbors, because the ship's captain and a navigator probably is not familiar with a particular harbor, so that a pilot will go out in a boat and he will get on the ship and he will help direct the ship into the harbor or out of the harbor. Okay, the last guy I listed on this job code was a switchman, and there's other jobs, by the way, but I listed the switchman and I put him in highlight because we're going to talk later in the presentation about the switchman and his importance as it developed through the years. Okay, basic yard examples. This is two really simple ones. Again, we're off the main line where it's controlled by signals. There's the top picture shows arrival, departure, class track, storage, a switching lead, and a locomotive track for service and so forth. Right, so that's a basic yard example. Next one down has two main lines. Again, arrival, departure, yard body, a yard lead. I don't show any other types of facilities on the bottom picture, but again, it's off the main line. So that's that falls under the description or definition of a yard from the CFR, that it has nothing to do, the yard has absolutely nothing to do with the controlled area of the railroad. I'm going to go to the next one, and it's a little more complicated. This guy is Howard Yard. This is Howard Yard is located in the northeast, and I picked this one because it was kind of a confusing looking freight yard. And this yard again is located in Chicago. It's an MTA yard, and you see all the loops and so forth, and it has a shop, and it has other facilities in the yard, and part of the yard is on the south side of the up in the upper left-hand corner. It shows where north is, but I'm going to say that part of the yard is on the south side of the main, and part of the yard is on the north side of the main. And this will eventually lead us into what the other part of our discussion, which is yard limits, and why we need yard limits. So again, these yards are off the main. You can see that the main comes through the city of Howard with a couple right here. There's a couple of platforms for the MTA to go through. Part of the MTA goes down this way on its westbound and eastbound main line tracks. Part of it goes here west and east, and of course this one here as well. You'll notice that this loop in the middle right here, oops, I could quit hitting the mouse button. This loop in the middle comes around, and it is not part of the yard. It is a mainline loop. So some of the MTA cars, they come from the east and they come down here and they make a circle route and they continue back east again. So that's part of the main line. And I think this one right here is just a turning loop for cars that were from the west going back west, and the same thing with these loops out here. Of course, the loops here are from the shop it's So, and this is a big storage yard. At night, this thing is probably full of about, well, it says 282 cars. So it's going to have 200 cars or more sitting in this yard at night, waiting for the morning rush hours. So that's a large prototype yard, and how it might be on both sides of the main line. And so how do we get across? We use this thing called yard limits, right? Yard limits, again, back to the CFR, Title 49, Subtitle B, Chapter 2, Part 218. And in this case, it's Subpart 218.35. And that is yard limits. Now, yard limits is going to be a little more complex than the yard definition. First of all, it says, after August 1st, 1977, yard limits must be designated by, and there's two things there, yard limit signs and timetable, train orders, or special instructions. And of course, the reason for that is you're going out on the main line. You are not a train on the timetable. So yard limits have to be very specific about where they are and where you can go and where you can find the information for yard limits. It goes on to say, and there's a lot, you must have operating rules which complies with the requirements set forth below. Remember, this is not a rule. This is just a definition of what the rules need to have. Main tracks within yard limits may be used, clearing the time and approaching designated class train is due to, all that kind of stuff. So in case of failure, you must provide protection, and you'll find that most of the rule books will have a separate rule just for the protection portion of this definition. The in yard limits, main tracks are governed by block signals, and protection is prescribed by 218.37 is not required if there are signal systems available. Lots of caveats. Trains and engines, except designated class trains within yard limits, must move prepared to stop within 1/2 the range of vision, but not exceeding 20 miles per hour, unless the main track is known to be clear by a block signal. The interesting thing about this is you could go to some of the rule books and you won't find the part about 20 miles per hour in the same rule as yard limits rule. You'll find it in a different rule, and it might be 89 or 81 or something like that, and it's called restricted speed. And so they leave it up to the railroads to write their rule books in whatever fashion they need to be. This goes on to say that within yard limits, movements against the current of traffic on the main must not be made unless authorized and protected by train orders, yard masters, and other designated officials, and only under the operating restrictions of 218.35. So here again, it's allowing the railroads to decide, okay, who is the authorized guy that says I can take my train out in yard limits. I don't have to call the dispatcher. I don't have to call God or anybody else. I can, my local operator or yard master says, okay, you can go out in yard limits and operate your train. And then it goes on to say each railroad should designate in the operating rule prescribed under paragraph B, back wherever B was, of this section, the class or class of trains which shall have superiority over the main tracks within yard limits. Now, most of the rule books will tell you that you have to be clear of yard limits or clear of the main track within yard limits of first class trains. But it could be a second class or a particular type of commuter train or so forth. So again, they're leaving it up to the railroads to define these kind of things. And that's what you'll find in the railroad rule books. And that's why all the railroad books are different. The rule books, you need, if you're going to do a particular railroad, you need to find a rule book that's for your railroad. All right, so in the Northeast Operating Rules Advisory Committee, what in the world is that? All right, that is a group of railroads, and Amtrak is included in this, that are in the Northeast part of the United States, and they have their own rule book. And it very basically, it says the same thing I just went over on the guidelines from the CFR. But you'll notice that it says passenger bullet number 4, I think it is, item 1. Passenger trains operating with Form D, Line 2 authority in non-signal DCS territory may operate at normal speed. So what happened to the restricted speed thing, right? That's the thing with rules. It is yes, maybe, and sometimes. So you got to have your rule book. The trains operating ABS territory may operate according to signal indication. So what if the signal has a high green and the speed limit through that area is 55 miles an hour, right? You could go through yard limits at 55 miles an hour, right? So there's all kinds of variations of the rules that each individual railroad might have. And again, the rule books are developed from a group of railroads within that area of, say, the United States Northeast in this case. Way back when we talked about the consolidated code of operating rules, those were up in the Pacific Northwest, and even they had caveats to their rules depending on whether the branch line went along the coast where you might have stormy and foggy weather. So the restricted speeds were different. And so again, get a rule book for your railroad. Here is Form D. The item on this Form D that NORAC is specifically alluding to is item number 2, which is operate in, and then there's a blank, direction or directions on track such and such, between times so and so. So you could put down east/west, north/south, east, both, whatever you want to put in there, so that you can operate within yard limits, and have your Form D filled out and transmitted to your to the folks that are leaving the yard and going into the yard limit area. So this is also called a Form T on some railroads. It is also called a track warrant on some railroads. So in this case, NORAC calls it a Form D. And actually, there's quite a few railroads that call it Form D. Okay, so can everybody see the top line of this slide? It says, see, I can't see it. Oh, Rule 613 yard limits. There we are. Now I can see it. I had something in the way. Rule 6.13 yard limits code of from the code of general code of operating rules. Again,
Genial.
beg pardon?
The genial code of operating rules.
Oh, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Or missed an R in there.
Yeah, I did. This is slide 27.
Yeah,
I've
make a
got-
note, make a note.
Yeah, I've got my list right here so that I can make notes. So slide 27, GENERAL. All right, thank you, Jim. I can always rely on Jim, by the way.
Well, unless I fall asleep.
Well, he reads an awful lot of stuff for me, and that, so thank you. All right, so here again, it's the same verbiage in a sense that that we looked at in NORAC previously. It's just not called Rule 93, it's called Rule 6.13. Some rule books are developed in a paragraph numbering situation. I believe now these days, my latest copy of, pretty sure my latest copy of the General Code of Operating Rules actually uses Rule 93. So they went away from the paragraph numbering system somewhere along the line. I don't know when. Again, it's the same type of verbiage. Beg your pardon?
Nothing, sorry. That was just a big sigh.
Right.
I will mute myself here again.
Okay, so yard limits, 613 continued, yard limits remain in effect continuously unless otherwise specified by special instructions or track bulletins. A comment about that. If you've been following Canadian National any length of time over the last few years, you've noticed that they've bought more railroads in the United States. One of their recent acquisitions was the EJ&E in Chicago. I hope they never buy at least I don't think they've ever bought the Beltline yet, but when they bought EJ&E, they needed to develop yard limits in an area that didn't exist. So they applied to the FRA, and 35 pages later of application, they were able to get approved for a new set of yard limits. It included all kinds of safety stuff, realignment of the main line, realignment and elimination of some of their yard tracks and all that. So they were able to develop yard limits that didn't exist before. So the yard limits are not something that's set in stone. You can make changes. Against the current of flow of traffic, or current of traffic, what do you want to call it? The movements against the current of traffic must not be made unless authorized or protected by track warrant, track bulletin, yard master, or other authorized employee. Pretty loose, pretty loose. In CTC territory where yard limits are in effect, in CTC territory, the control operator must authorize any movement on the main track. Reverse movements within the same block may be made as outlined in Rule 641. So you can see that when we had our basic rule or basic definition of a yard, which was a bunch of tracks for making up trains, and then we get into yard limits that have absolutely nothing to do with yards and everything to do with moving equipment on the main line, there's all kinds of additional definitions that the railroads must abide by. And by the way, here's 641. This is permission for reverse movement. Obtain permission from a train dispatcher or control operator before making a reverse movement in the same block, any of the following territories: CTC, signal, track warrant control, or 914 movement with the current of traffic, right? So restricted limits between designated points specified by signs and in the special instruction, trains and engine may use the main track, not protecting, and this is important, not protecting against other trains or engines. All movements must be at restricted speed. Movements against the current of flow must not be made unless authorized and protected by track warrant, track bulletin, yard master, or other authorized employees. See how loose they make this? You got to be real careful in yard limits. And let's see, let me stay on this for a minute. So what happens here is the rule books will develop, or the railroads will develop rules in the rule books for protecting against movement of other trains. And it might just say something like, you've got to be able to stop within half the distance of the train you see down the track. So you got to be careful how you define restricted limits. Remember back in the CFR, it said 20 miles an hour was the maximum speed for restricted speed. Unless, of course, there are signals that let you go faster, or you've got a rule book that says you can't go 20. SP on their branch lines in yard limits, their branch lines are restricted to 12 miles an hour. But that's under 20, so they can put that in their rule book and still be authorized by the CFR. So what's the purpose of yard limits? Yard limits is an extension of yard switching in both automatic block system and manual block system territory. It gives an area where moves can be made without train orders, Form Ds, et cetera, just by permission of an operator or dispatcher. But as you see, some of the rule books might say, oh no, you got to have a Form D. Well, that's their prerogative, right? It is usually used in areas near yards and where frequent reverse moves are to be made. And that stands to reason. If you get it, if your yard is backed up and you need to use the main line to get around the other side of your train, then the railroad may establish yard limit areas for you to be able to do that. And yard limits have nothing to do with the actual yard or switching limits. And we'll talk about switching limits a little bit later. I was hoping that Mike Switzer would be on here because he was asking in one of his emails yesterday about developing yard limits in the yard. Well, there are no yard limits in the yard. They only have to do with movements on the main line. All right, so CTC territory where yard limits are in effect, in CTC territory, the control operator may authorize any movement on the main track. Usually the control operator they're talking about here is a dispatcher, not a yard operator or a local operator in a station or whatever. He's usually the control operator, and he's usually the dispatcher of the line in that particular area of control. And then, so he can give you, see, CTC territory is completely different than MBS or ABS or TCS or direct train control, DTC, all those kind of different signaling systems. CTC territory is kind of a mother bear for everybody else. So all right, so yard limit advantages. What's the biggest advantage that is being solved with yard limits? Is back and forth movement. Again, getting around the other side of your train, outside of the confines of the yard. Ordinarily, a train is expected to proceed in one direction from its origin to its destination, so backing up is forbidden without special permission. And you wouldn't want to do this outside of yard limits. If you've got a passenger train and you're going down the track east to west, you should be going, if you're going from east to west, you should be always going west. You should not be backing up. Right? Yard limits mostly means trains may move both directions without special permission, and any train entering the yard limits needs to proceed at restricted speed, whatever that speed is for your particular railroad and codes. Watching for other trains in any direction. Also, yard limits movements are often governed by a yard master, operator, or dispatcher. In CTC territory, it's 99.999% is going to be a dispatcher. Operator, the operator at a station or a depot, or the yard master himself could say, okay, go on out in the yard and do your run around switching or whatever you need to do. The other nice advantage of yard limits is if you've got in one of our earlier pictures, you've got your station on the other side of the track, other side of the main line from the yard. So you need to move a freight car over to the house track, or you need to move a passenger train car from one end from the station over to the yard. You do that within yard limits. So when we look at that, we see that example right here. Now we've got the yard at the bottom of the pictures, and we have the main line outlined in red at the top, and that's. There you go, folks. I'll wait.
No, go.
Okay. So, all right. So the main line in these pictures is outlined in red. That's the area of yard limits. You notice it has nothing to do with the yard at all, and that's hard to understand why yard limits and yards are two distinctly different entities. So we go back to our large yard example, and here we see yard limits are outlined in red, yards are not. Right. So remember the previous picture I showed, the yards were at the upper and lower on both sides of the main line. Now we can move within yard limits. We can move cars from the lower yard or the south yard, whatever you want to call it, across the main line to the upper yard. And in this case, they've made it real easy for part of that. They've got a couple bridges on the left side, and I'll point this out right here. All right, you can move between the 2 yards without affecting the main line. But up here, if you go out here and move over this way, you have to move through yard limits. So, so that's the advantage of yard limits here. Okay, how do we identify yard limits? Again, way back when we talked about yard limits in 218.35, I think it was, it said that you need to identify yard limits in a timetable or warning signs and so forth. So if we take a look at, let me see if I got that on here. Yes, I couldn't remember if I did that. Yard limits are usually identified between milepost signs, right? And so if you're going to somebody's model railroad, you might find that they've used milepost markers on their railroad. I have them on mine. Mine are based right off the Western Pacific Railroad employee timetable. So if you go to where John works down at Provo, for instance, he will find milepost markers for Provo, and if you went back to the employee timetable, you'd find those same numbers in that timetable. Is Alan on here? I think Alan Black's on here too. He usually works Wendover, and again, those milepost markers and yard limits are at Wendover. So warning signs placed along the main track. In my case, they're on the fascia. I haven't made the yard limit signs yet, but someday they might be on the railroad itself. But I do have yard limit signs on the fascia, so I kind of have an idea where the yard limits are at. But they're usually placed right along this main line. So if we take a look at the Western Pacific timetable in my case, you'll see that yard limits are identified in the timetable, the employee timetable. That's right there on page, whatever it is, 26. And it tells you the milepost markers where the yard limits start and where they end. Now, sometimes like the one at Reno, that's a branch line. So Western Pacific named all their branch lines with a B and some other letter. Reno's branch line was BI. So that's why it says BI with milepost markers such and such, and the end of the yard limits is the end of the branch. That yard limits is 30 some miles long. Their entire branch is a yard limits area. So they can go from their little yards along the branch out on the main back and forth. And they have basically free roam of the main line from one end of the branch to the other. And you can see that right here, BI, milepost 32 point, whatever it is, to the end of branch. Carlin, Elko, really, and Salt Lake City, they have their yard limits as well. And there, it says indicated by yard limit signs. So not only is it in the timetable, but it's also listed by signs. There's all kinds of other information in the timetable that is great to know for your model railroad. I didn't put it in the presentation, but here's a thing over here. It says tonnage limits, or tonnage ratings rather, and it's listed by locomotive type and how many tons that locomotive can haul. So if you're trying to figure out how many cars you should put on your train, you could use something like this out of the timetable to help you determine that on your model railroad. All right, so here's some examples of warning signs and yard limit signs. You'll see that they even have warning, says 1 mile. There's a couple different examples there. The triangle one is pretty old. The rectangle one that says 1 mile to yard limit, that is still in use today in a number of places. The yard limit sign on the left, lower left, the oval one, that's an older one. I don't know how new the yellow one is, but you see it's got the, I don't know what they call those little glass things in the
Yep.
signs, the reflector glass. So that was probably used in the 40s and 50s. And then the one you see most these days is the Y-shaped post that says yard limit. So, all right, so let's go into something that's completely different than yards and yard limits. Before I do that, anybody got any questions about yards and yard limits? They're totally different bears. All right, let's go to this thing called switching limits. Switching limits, you won't find switching limits in any code or regulation manuals. It doesn't exist in the books. All right. You can search all day in this. Where's it at here? Oh, you know what? It doesn't show up in the picture, or in the because of the way the camera's working. You can switch all or search all day in the code, the uniform, the general code of operating rules, or the NORAC or whatever, and you will not find switching limits listed.
Okay, back up to your title again. Make a note.
Thank you.
Missing an H.
I'm missing an H. And what slide is this? 38. Oh, good. Yeah, because I need to do this. I'm glad you're finding this stuff, because I need to do this presentation again on first Friday in March. Let's see, 38.
Well, if you only got a couple of those, it's a pretty darn good job.
Well, we're not through it all. Almost.
Yeah, you said you're on slide 38. You promised only 40 slides.
Yeah, we're pretty close. Yeah. Okay, so what is switching limits? Well, the switchmen in the yards, they do a lot of work, and they started a union with the AFL-CIO. I don't know how long ago, but probably in the 40s. And they wanted more pay, and they wanted more prestige and more work than what they were getting paid to do. So they developed this thing called the Switchmen's Union of North America. And what it was a binding agreement that the railroads had to buy into individually. They all had their own document. And it allowed switchmen to go a certain distance from their home yard to switch a local train. So when you look at rule five, and this is not a rule 5 in the general code of operating rules, this is rule 5 in the switching limits union agreement. It says all transfer, construction, maintenance, away worker, work, wrecker service performed within switching limits will be the work of switchmen who will receive switchman's rate of pay. So if you've got switching limit, here's an example of how you could use this on your railroad. Let's say you've got a couple industries that are a few miles away from your home yard where the switchman works. He will ride on the train with the crew, and he will do the switching in that yard, the switching work portion in that yard before the train goes out of switching limits to the next line or next area down the road. So they developed switching limits, and it could be quite extensive. There could be quite a few areas designated for switching limits. On my railroad, I'll explain how that will work in just a bit. Boundaries within which switching rules and charges apply, not to be confused with yards or yard limits. They have nothing to do with yards and yard limits. Again, you won't find switching limits in the books. They're a union agreement for each railroad company. They have to buy into it. Switching limits. Now, this next bullet I got from a guy on the Western Pacific Groups IO. He was kind enough to send me his take on switching limits, as he used to be an employee of Western Pacific out in California. He says it's the line drawn in the sand between, and it was before 1972, but between Switchmen's Union of North America and the Order of Railway Road Conductors and the Brotherhood of Railway Trainmen. They all had to buy into this, that everything that was within switching limits belonged to the switchmen, and everything else belonged to the road crews. So this is what I say, that you could have switching limits within, I don't know, maybe 10 miles of your yard, home yard for a switchman. And he does all the groundwork, and he gets paid for it. Because if you think about it, a 5-man crew on a train back then, did they have a switchman? No. What they had was a 5-man crew was the engineer, conductor, head brakeman, rear brakeman, and conductor. They didn't have a switchman. And that's where the switchman said, hey, wait a minute, I should be doing some of the switching. So they developed this union agreement with the railroads. A little confusing, but it's something different, and you can apply it to your model railroad. I'll show you how to do that in just a minute. Here's a front cover page from the Great Northern Company schedule of rules, rates, rules, regulations for switchmen. And again, it's represented by the Switchmen's Union of North America through the AFL-CIO. And you can see this is effective date of September 1, 1957. So this is an old document. If you ever want to see it, I can send it to you. I have the complete PDF document of this schedule. All right, so let's go back to the Western Pacific 1964 employee timetable, and look what you see right under yard limits on the timetable. You see switching limits, all right? So obviously the Western Pacific bought into switching limits with the Switchmen's Union. And if you take a look at those limits, again, they're designated by mileposts, all right? And down at the bottom, 92606 is milepost Salt Lake City, all the way to the, I think, to the end. Let's see, yeah, to the end of the branch. So,
That would
or to
be
the end of the main line, excuse me.
the end of the Western Pacific main line.
Yeah, Western Pacific
Yes.
main line, right. So how do I use it on my railroad? Well, if you take a look at Wendover, which is one of the towns I model, and you go a little bit west, I'm sorry, a little bit east of Wendover is a town called Blair. And Alan, if you're still online here, you know where Blair is. And the interesting thing about this is switching limits for Wendover is 805.28 to 808.31. Well, the actual yard for Wendover is at 806.2 on the milepost. So that's within the switching limits of the Wendover portion of this, of the WP switching limits. And Blair is at 808, right? So the switching limits goes to 808.31. So on my railroad, I can take the advantage of this union agreement for switchmen and employ it on my railroad, because Wendover and Blair are within the switching limits of the union agreement for switchmen on Western Pacific. So what I do is, and I didn't know about this until probably about 2 years ago, and it's been since I've had an op session. But so what I've done now is I've got a company truck that sits over at Blair, and it brings the switchman back home to his home yard in Wendover. And then the train continues on past Blair to its next station down the line. So so this allows in this case, Alan, who usually switches Wendover, it allows him to switch Wendover and Blair without having to have a road train go back and forth. Yes, Jim.
Yeah, I never realized that mile posts could be measured in, or were measured in tenths and hundredths
Oh yeah.
of a mile.
Yeah, well, they do it even on your highways. If you see,
Yeah, they do tenths. I know.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
you see those on highway signs. So I guess
Well,
tenths.
yeah, I know it's tenths and hundreds on the railroad, and I think that has to do with the exact location of a spur or the beginning of a siding.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay, that would make sense.
Or a bridge that's going across, and especially where two railroads cross each other.
Oh, yeah.
You know, at a diamond.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah, so they get pretty precise. So I now employ switching limits on my railroad, which I didn't probably do 4 years ago. So, but there again, you won't find it in the code books. You're going to find it as a specific item on the railroad you're modeling, and it's going to be a switchman's union agreement. Oops, I got to get back on it. All right, lo and behold, if you go to Walther's catalog, you can actually find switching limit sign sets. I didn't know they existed, but here they are. They are not yard limit signs. They are not speed limit signs or anything like that. They are switching limit signs, and I'm going to put one up at Blair. So, and I didn't know these existed until just a couple of weeks ago. I was searching around on switching limit, and these signs popped up as a shopping thing. So I'm going to buy or make some like I'm N scale. So I imagine, yeah, these are for HO scale, but I'll make some small ones for N scale, I guess.
Hey,
yes, John.
You want to correct the spelling on that switching limit
Switching.
sign.
See, this is where you copy and paste too much. What one is this? Is 42. Thanks, John.
Beat me to it.
Yeah, I got it. Yeah.
It
Okay.
doesn't matter how many times you review it at home on your computer. These all show up when you show them on the big screen at your first presentation.
Oh yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Okay,
a fact of life.
So switching limits is a totally different bear. It has nothing to do, and you won't find. I have not found switching limits in the CFR either. All right, the Code of Federal Regulations. They're union agreements, and I'm not sure they take effect anymore. Okay. My friend on the WP groups list, he said pre-1972, so maybe switching limits are no longer in observance. Now, if you go out to, they say Google is your friend, all right? You got to be careful with Google. If you go out and switch and search for switching limits, you're probably going to find some information about switching limits. You'll also find under the same searches a thing called reciprocal switching, right? That is not part of this presentation. And reciprocal switching has nothing to do with switching limits or yard limits or yards, right? So, but it's an interesting aspect of what the modern railroads do today, which is reciprocal switching. So, and there's some good videos on that. So if you ever want to go out and look for that, look for reciprocal switching, kind of interesting to read about. All right, do I have any more questions up to this point? All right, I want to go over the bibliography, and this is the last slide, if you can bear with me. Code of Federal Regulations, you can find the entire code at ecfr.gov. And I should mention that when you look at that and you go to 49, which is transportation, or you'll find 99% of what you want to know about railroads in that title 49. However, the Code of Federal Regulations has information about railroads in many of their titles. An example is, let me see if I can find my notes on that. If you go to Title 20 of the CFR will talk about things of insurance and workman's compensation and so forth for railroad operators or railroad employees. Title 23 will talk about, this is an interesting one. Title 23, this could be probably a presentation by itself. Title 23 talks about highway, railroad grade crossings and other railroad road projects. So, and that's in Title 23. In both Title 49, besides railroads, you go to Title 47, which has got all the FCC rules and regulations. Well, obviously railroads are covered under that requirements because we do radio communications in railroads and all kinds of other stuff. I don't know whether positive train control is covered under 47, but it probably is. Railroads employ fiber optics, they employ microwave and all that kind of stuff. Well, all that has to do with FCC. So that's in Title 47. Another example would be Title 7, which is agriculture, right? Would you think that'd be having to do with railroads? Yeah, all the stuff with our movement of livestock and anything else that has to do with plants and animals will be in Title 7, and railroads are covered in Title 7. All right, rail yards, list of list of rail yards. It's a Wikipedia site, and that's an interesting one because if you're interested in a particular railroad and you want to find out if they have a big yard, it's probably going to be listed there. Right? Employee timetables, rule books, safety books, all those you can get from eBay, swap meets, historical societies. If you don't belong to this historical society of the railroad you're modeling, I suggest that you do join. It's a few bucks a year usually, and you can get all kinds of information that'll help you with your model railroad. The official guide of railways, I mentioned that this was changed names sometime, I forget exactly when, but sometime in the 90s or earlier. That was when it was last published, and then it was published by a new company called Rail Resource, which now is no longer in business, and they changed the name to the Official Railway Guide, and it was mostly about freight railroads and didn't have any passenger information in it like the official guide did. The official one that was published earlier. The ORER is also got a new publisher now, but I don't remember what it is. That's not important. But again, you can get those on eBay or swap meets. Look for one for your particular year. The one for official register of pasture train equipment, eBay, swap meets. Again, it was not published after Amtrak. Other material and publications, like I showed earlier, of books about dining cars and interchange rules and things like that. You can get those from your historical society or eBay swap meets and so forth. And switching limits, again, has nothing to do with yards and yard limits. It's going to be difficult to find the union agreements because they no longer exist. You might find references to them, but the historical societies may have them in their archives, which would help you on your model railroad like it's going to do for me on mine, that I now have switching limits between Wendover and Blair. Modeling resources, again, modeling signs and so forth, you'll get that from your hobby suppliers. Rights of Trains, it is on Amazon, and the code of operating rules is from lulu.com, and that is still available. You can buy that.
Yep, you can buy it on the internet. Looks like $15.
Yeah, it's pretty reasonable. So what if there's no questions, I'll stop sharing. Unless you want to go back to a particular slide. So that's what I have about yards and yard limits and how they might apply to your model railroad, and we covered a little bit about rules. So
Very good.
Yeah, you just need to make sure that the guys you have over for your operating session are non-union. If you get in trouble.
yeah, okay.
No, he's gonna have his switching limits up there, and he's gonna have to have a switchman out there to do that job.
Right. Well, I've got vehicles that have company logos on them, so I'm going to park one in Blair.
Yeah, now we know why they're there. That's great.
Back to Wendover for you there, Alan.
They get asked about extra pay if they do a job.
Yeah.
That's right.
And I said, there's cookies out in the other room.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to say. There's the goodie table out there. When you take a break, have an extra cookie.
Well, that'll be so you can segregate the snacks. These are for switchmen, these are for conductors.
Oh, there you go. Okay. Yeah.
Don't be having those Oreos are for switchmen only. Come on.
Yeah.
There's another document I found here, Googling away at the code of operating rules for model railroads. There's one called the Standard Code of Operating Rules for Model Railroads. It was published in 2006.
Oh.
And it's available under a website for the San Antonio Model Railroad Association, SAMRA. But if you just were Googling that, whatever it is, the condensed, if you can Googling condensed code of operating rules.
Yeah.
And you scroll down just a little ways, you'll find the standard code of operating rules for model railroads.
Of, not for?
Four model railroads.
Okay.
Standard code of operating rules for model railroads. And it's several pages long, and it looks like it's fashioned from actual operating rules of certain specific railroads in the Southwest.
And that's true about every single code book. Is they will list in the front of the book which railroads
the railroads
following those particular codes. So I don't know. I guess I can't.
Kind of funny how they would do that for a model railroad, but
Yeah. All right. So let's see here. Okay, I can hold it in front of me. You can see this. This book is the Consolidated Code of operating rules, right? And when you open it up, see if I can get to the right page quickly enough. Okay, when you open it up, it will actually list which railroads this particular code book covers,
Yep.
right? And that's why your standard code for operating model railroads has got a list of probably 4 or 5 or a dozen model railroads.
Yeah, it
Bought
does.
into that.
There's actually 5 of them on here.
Okay, so
It's like they're basically all Arizona.
yeah, right. And that is exactly how real railroad code books are
Yeah.
laid out. If you take a look at the one that says condensed code of operating rules, and this is also for model railroads, there's about 3 dozen model railroads listed in this book.
Huh.
But they're all kind of in the general area of the United States. So
Mhm.
so that's very prototypic of
Well, this one's free. You can print it out. It's 15 pages.
oh, cool. All right. Yeah, there's a lot of them out there. You can find timetables, you can find other model railroaders that have written code books for their model railroad, and you can print them out. Excuse me. So yeah, so it's a lot of fun. It's the reason I like it is because I find that the code books and the timetables and so forth, if you can find that information that's specific to a railroad that you're modeling that's prototype or near
Mhm.
prototype or freelance, proto freelance, I think they call it. It'll help you with the design of your railroad and your operations. That it'll be an enhancement that you don't have to think about what to do because the stuff is right there to tell you what to do. So, you know,
Okay.
who knows?
Very good.
All right.
Well, thank you very much, Chuck, for preparing that presentation. It was very informative.
You're
Um,
welcome.
Yeah.
Thanks
lots
for
of fun.
thanks for hanging in there. It's a little longer than what we normally do, but
That's all right.
I had a lot of fun putting this together. So
Yeah, there's a lot of detail there. It's great. And that's the thing, being prototypical can mean many different things. And one of them is following those rules.
you're right. And what the part that I found was interesting is starting at the Code of Federal Regulations and then working my way down. Right, there's a lot of loosey-goosey stuff there
Mhm.
that you can just create your own rules. You know.
Yeah.
So
Well, that's basically what most railroads did.
yes, right, and
Yeah.
it's just like Ron's 1858 rule number, whatever it was,
Yep.
8. All right, it was a rule in somebody's timetable, and they said, "Hey, no, you got to back up because I'm bigger than you are," or whatever.
Yeah. Well, all these different organizations have an interest in making sure that these railroads
Yeah.
run efficiently and safely.
Yep.
But the higher you go in the hierarchy, the less they understand the nitty gritty
Mhm.
details. So,
Well, I find the rules are interesting. Some people will say, I don't need the rules. And that's why I say rules are yes, maybe, and sometimes.
right.
You know. So I know when I joined the Navy, the first book they gave me was the Blue Jackets Manual, and so which is probably after 22 years, it's probably in the bottom of a box in the closet someplace.
But you still have it.
Yeah.
All right, very good. Well, this will I'll make some edits to chop out the beginning of this where we were just chewing the fat, and so we'll have this recording out on the YouTube site along with Thursday's clinic. I haven't put that out yet. I'll do that this afternoon, and thanks everybody for coming. And again,
Thank you.
Chuck, great job on the presentation. Appreciate you looking into that for us and sharing what you found.
Yeah, a lot of fun.
All right, great.
Yep.
Well, guys, enjoy your Saturday.
All right, take care.
Good to look at Dan's helix back there.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
good
there you
stuff.
go. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, you can't see mine. Mine is under a mountain.
under there. Yeah, in the back.
And then there's another one in front of me that's also under a mountain. They are hidden. the nice thing I like about mine, Dan, is I made my mountains tall enough that I can actually stand up inside my helix.
That's cool.
And I have
Wow.
lights in there that will automatically come on when you walk in under the helix.
Wow.
I've been thinking about putting some kind of a scenic dome over the top of it,
Yeah.
you know, but I got so much stuff out, other stuff.
It would have,
Well,
wouldn't it be a golden dome?
Ah,
Oh,
I don't
For
know.
Dan, at least for Dan.
Yeah, for
Right.
Dan, right.
He's a domer.
Yeah.
Left that place over 4 years ago, so.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So you've forgotten by now.
He's almost getting used to retirement.
Yeah. Oh, good.
Nice job, Chuck.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Very nice.
All
All
right,
right, you guys take care. I'm headed to Hot Dogs Plus for lunch.
all right. Enjoy your lunch. We'll see you guys.
Good
Talk
to you.
idea.
mm,
Bye.
bye.